What levels should your sounds be at? Today I'm going to tell you. So the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to go through two different stages of the music making process. I'm going to look into the production stage as well as the mixing stage for this. So when it comes to the production stage, this is what it looks like. This is a project of mine in the production stage, so this is inside of Ableton. And you can see that I'm just putting in the sounds. We have parts where there's just kick and bass for now. There's kick and bass and drum over here, for example. We have parts that we looked at in the last video, which is the breakdown. And you can see that I'm still writing the track, of course. In this spaces, there's no sequences yet. In this spaces, there's a lack of one-shots. There's no effects yet. There's very few atmospheres in there. So the track is still very barren and very empty. Now, what that means in terms of setting volume for elements, apart from a few standard volumes that I always like to set, for example, my kick at -8 and my bass at -9, for all of the other sounds, I basically have to come up with a volume on the spot. And this is something that I can experiment with throughout the production stage. Sometimes I like to have some elements a little bit louder, sometimes I have some elements a little bit quieter, and I just go back and forth and listen to how the sounds sound like when it's a little bit louder or when it's a little bit quieter. Now, because I'm working on 10 different projects at the time, especially during the times where I'm working on an album, like is the case right now, what ends up happening is that I have a whole bunch of different versions and I just kind of go back and forth between different projects. And during that time, during the afternoon that I spent working on one project that I haven't touched for a while, I'll mess around with all of the volumes. And it is just a standard part of the production process in the sense that when you come back to a production that you haven't seen for a while, that is the first thing that you're going to do. You're going to say like, hey, wait, this sound is unnaturally loud, or hey, this sound isn't really giving me the energy that I wanted to. It needs to be a little bit louder. But what I'm never doing is I'm never really trying to aim for a final volume. I'm just testing out what the sound is going to do in this volume versus that volume. Of course, it is nice when the production is going to sound like a finished mix, so we are aiming at the end of the day for something that works in the production mix. But I always realize that I'm actually going to do the final mix of the track later on. So what I'm really trying to do is I'm just trying to get a feel for the sound, and it doesn't really matter if the volume is exactly precise. That means that what I tend to do is I just go into the DAW over here, say that I have any volume, and I just tap up and down, like in dBs. And even though an increment of 0.5 dB is something that you can definitely hear in a finished mix, if you're just comparing two different settings that are half a dB apart, you can definitely notice that difference. For the production, that doesn't really matter because I'm not trying to get it as precise as you would in a mixing contest. Now, there's a lot of debate about headroom and such, and really when it comes to the headroom debate, as long as you have some headroom, you're going to be fine. What I mean by that, say that this is our master track over here, there's nothing on there, and we want to have 6 dB of headroom. But right now we have 4 dB of headroom. What we can do is you can just add a utility and just turn the master down by 2 dB. Now you have 6 dB of headroom after this utility. So at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. There are some DAWs where you can even go over the clipping level. For example, Ableton, that is actually in 32-bit floating point, meaning that internally the ceiling of clipping is actually a little bit higher than 0 dB. It's in the 3-4 dB-ish. I'm not exactly sure where it is, but it's essentially higher than 0 dB. But that is as long as you stay within the project. Of course, once you start to export stuff, that is where it gets converted into an actual audio file, and there it becomes a different story. But within some DAWs, you can actually clip over 0 without actually clipping, without actually getting the negative distortions that is usually associated with that process. In other DAWs, you have to stay strictly under 0 dB. Sometimes that even depends for in-between tracks and in-between groups and stuff like that. So say that this track, for whatever reason, outputs at maybe 1 dB positive. So say that we have this group over here, which in this production is my kick group. As you can see, I'm setting the volume over here to -8, which means that for my actual kick drum, I'm not changing the volume whatsoever. If for some particular reason I decided to maybe add a process to this that makes the kick a little bit louder, in some DAWs, what could be the case is that it already clips going from this track into this group, meaning that there will be an issue there. But this is something that you can easily avoid by giving yourself a little bit more space. What I do recommend is not giving you too much space. There is something as having too much space in terms of headroom, because what tends to happen is that people don't really mix outside of their production projects. Like I'm going to show you a different project later on that is in a different DAW. Most people don't do that. Most people produce, mix, and master all in the same project. And what can happen is that you can have a problem where if you start off with your kick and bass at a very low headroom volume, you're going to stack up elements and stack up more things. And because you never are going to hit the physical limits that you have in the audio file, you're going to exceed the limit that you have in your mix. Because a certain level of kick and bass requires a certain level for the leads, which requires a certain level for the hats, and so on and so on. Of course, dependent on the context. Now, when it comes to the context, I know that a lot of people just want me to say a certain number for a certain category of sound, but that is just not how it works. At the end of the day, within the category of sounds, you're going to have different loudnesses of those sounds, and that is what you're accounting for when you set volume. It is not the category that determines the volume, it is the loudness of the sound that you're trying to mix in and its priority in the mix. So I can sit here and I can tell you, okay, you're going to have your kick peak at -8 and your bassline peak at -9, but that only really works if you have my workflow of creating kick and bass, because this technique was developed with my workflow. For example, your kick and bass may be a little bit more dynamic than mine, in which case you can go a little bit more liberal with that, in the sense that you could go for a kick and bass where the kick is playing at -8 and the bassline is playing at -10 or even -11. I would say there's also a possibility of going the other way around, but that doesn't really happen, in the sense that the bassline is never really louder than the kick. The kick is the most important element and therefore it's the loudest. But how much louder the kick is towards the bassline is not like a set number. There's no one number that you're doing it correctly, and if it's another number, then you're not doing it correctly. Of course, any tutorial that talks about volume really has to explain what that means. And when it comes to volume, the way that I like to look at most things is through peak volume. Now, this is not an accurate reading of loudness, but I know that. To be honest, I was trying to prepare a whole section on like different loudness and stuff like that, but that is so difficult that I'm going to leave that up to Dan Worrell, which probably already has done a video on that actually. Essentially though, what you need to know is that peak level, as I said, is not really a good representation of the actual loudness that you hear something at. It is just an indication of the loudest point that any element comes to. But I guess just through experience, I've learned to be able to balance things with peak level. And I know that because when I'm creating all of the elements, I have ultimate control over the dynamics. So I know exactly, okay, if I'm going to have this peak level, I'm probably going to sit roughly around that area in terms of the RMS, in terms of better loudness measurements. I've just personally set up a system that works around peak levels, and that is currently working for me. And that is the important thing. It's not about finding numbers, it's not about finding exact volumes, it is about creating a system for yourself that consistently leads you to good results. And the only way that you do that is to work with your workflow. And that is something that you have to figure out on your own. There's not really much that I can teach you that is going to make sure that the workflow that you choose actually works for you and actually gets you good results. That is something that you personally have to iterate on and see if it works. Like if you're getting inconsistent mixes because of your levels, then that is something that you maybe want to tackle. That is maybe something that you want to find a better workflow for. And really the only big tip that I can give you is when it comes to volume, you can think of it as priority. When stuff is louder, it is more important to the mix. So the kick is the important part, the most important part of a sidetrance track actually. And then the bass is the second most important. And then your main lead is the third most important. And then maybe your drums is the fourth most important. You can even have a few elements on the same kind of level. Maybe you would say, like for me, I'm going for a very groovy track, so the drums are very, very important. I'm going to put it on the same level as the bass line. That doesn't mean the same audio level, it doesn't mean the same volume yet. It just means the same priority in terms of the level of priority that it has. Where you have kick is the maximum priority, the second is the bass and the drums, and then the third is more elements and so on and so on. Because at the end of the day, as I said before, when you're mixing, you're determining the priorities of different elements and how the listener is going to perceive all of those elements. What you're essentially doing is you're setting up the balances that the listener is going to listen to. And if you're saying, okay, I want the listener to pay a little bit more attention to this element, then you make it a little bit louder. If you want it to be a little bit quieter, if you want the element to be a little bit more of a detail element, a little bit more of a background element, then you just make it a little bit quieter. The best things that I've ever done for my own mixes is just to export everything out of the production project and mix in a separate project. So here we are in one of those mixing projects. This is Reaper. Now, of course, you don't have to get a whole different DAW for this, although I do highly recommend using Reaper. If you're doing anything mixing related, then Reaper is very good at what it does. So if you are looking for a different DAW for mixing experience, then Reaper at $60 is definitely a good candidate for this. Now, when it comes to the exporting, what I do is I normalize everything when I'm exporting. So all of these tracks come into the project with the same level. And then for each of the tracks, what I'll do is I'll go into item properties over here and set it down by 8 dB. So I know that at least 8 dB of headroom is given for each of the tracks that I'm working with. Now, of course, they're going to sum together to something that is still much louder into the mix bus, which means that I have to go through the project and set different volumes everywhere, which you can see down below here. But you can see that all of these volumes that we have over here, where it says 0 dB on this one, it is actually -8 dB because we're setting it down -8 dB here in the item properties. And of course, again, this has to do with peak volume. This is the loudest sample within the whole audio file is set to -8 dB. Now, of course, with a lot of production experience and the maybe like 15, maybe even more, 17, 18 projects, I guess, that I've done inside of Reaper this way, that I've mixed this way, I've again built up my own workflow and built up my own experience to kind of know, even with peak volumes, what the balances should be. So what you're going to see is that my main kick is at 0 dB here in the mixer, meaning that it's peaking at -8 dB in the project. So you can see over here 0 and over here 0. That does of course take into account the idea that I'm volume balancing all of these different plugins over here, which I'm not necessarily doing. I obviously try to get close every time that I put a plugin on there, but I'm not able to set that precisely. But maybe I'll get a 1/10 of a dB more volume or 1/10 of a dB less volume, but that doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, my kick is going to get very close to peaking at -8 dB. And then my baseline is going to get very close over here, in this case, at peaking at -9.5 dB. As you can see over here, -1.5, you subtract another 8 from that, and you get -9.5. For the progressive baseline that sits in here, I needed to tone it down a little bit more because this was less of a dynamic baseline. This was more of like a sliding baseline, which tends to have a very consistent volume. Meaning that if I wanted the proper loudness for this baseline, I needed a lower peak volume for this baseline. Now really, that is basically all there is to it. There's not much more that I can explain here, in the sense that I can show you more numbers and I can show you more levels that I set within the project, but of course they're completely context dependent. And you may have noticed that in this video I didn't actually play any sounds for you guys, and that is very deliberately done in the sense that I just really wanted to sit down and talk a little bit. Of course I wanted to show some different things on the screen and such, but otherwise I could have done this without even recording my desktop. Because at the end of the day, there's not really much that I can show you that is actually going to put this idea into your mind in the form of a tutorial. This is something that you have to train yourself, and this is something that comes with time. As you produce more and more, you're just naturally going to get better at setting the volume for different elements. Now, of course, there are some things that you can do. One of the things that I often recommend to many people when it comes to improving their mixes is listening to a lot of reference material. Not necessarily when you're mixing, but before a mixing session, I tend to listen to reference material for usually an hour. So that is on the days that I'm actually doing mixing, that I'm doing mixing or mastering work. But on the other days, even when I'm not doing any mixing or mastering, I'll still listen to music for roughly half an hour to get an idea of what I'm doing that day. And generally also to just get my ears in tune. So I recommend you do the same if you have the capacity to do that. Of course, that is a great way to just improve your musical ability, is just to listen to a lot of other people's work and to see if you can identify certain levels, if you can identify certain things that they're doing in the mix and all of that kind of stuff. Another way to do that is to look at other people's way of producing, and that may be picking up on different workflow tips. For that, the only product that I can really recommend myself is my Masterclass 2.0, in which I cover every single detail about making a track over 24 hours of edited footage, including 7 hours on mixing specifically. So outside of the daily training and the thing that I talked about there with just listening to music, that is the other thing that you can do, is just try to pick up certain workflow related things. But what you're not going to pick up is like, okay, when he sets his kick to -8, I should set my kick to -8. When he sets his bass to -9, I should set my bass to -9. When he sets his drums to -12, I should set my drums to -12. That is not the way that you should look at these kind of things. As I said before in the video, your goal at the end of the day is to build up your own workflow, and just blatantly copying over somebody else's levels that they set is not going to work for you, because you may be working on a different style of sidevents that requires a different mix. So that's going to be it. That's everything that I wanted to talk about. I hope that you enjoyed it, even though this was a little bit more talking and a little bit less actually showing and letting you hear different things. I think it's still a very good topic to cover, even though it's more workflow related and it may be a little bit more boring. It might for some people also not be the thing that they wanted to hear, but I hope that it's useful anyway. Let me know if you did enjoy this video by leaving a like and making sure that you're subscribed. Another way that you can support the channel is by checking out some more of my content. There will be 2 videos up on the screen right now for you to choose from, so just pick one and enjoy, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.